Hello, and welcome to the Dissonance Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth will be speaking with Pam Hayes Bohanan, an academic librarian, about the potential inherent liberal bias in the book reviews that librarians use to make their collection decisions. Hello, and welcome back to the Dissonance Podcast. Today, I'm going to follow up with someone who was on our library panel back in April, National Library Week. We had a panel with three librarians, and for those of you who missed it, it was a great conversation, and we'll link it here in this podcast. And something came up at the end of that podcast, which we'd actually discussed in a pre-panel meeting, and we unfortunately didn't get to it, which is the inherent bias in, correct me if I'm wrong, Pam, but the inherent bias that may be in library review materials that are used for collection decisions. So Pam Hayes Bohanan, a librarian, a college librarian, recently college librarian, has been on the podcast before and talked about collection policies and such. But despite all of these policies and a librarian's best effort, they may still be sort of seeing biased materials or basically not seeing some materials, right? That would maybe influence you to make a collection decision. So have I kind of got that right?
Yes.
Okay. So we have how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. We actually have 5 different references to kind of quickly move through here, or not so quickly. Starting with one that you found from 1961 that we found, or you found, actually, because we were talking about McCarthyism and the late 40s and 50s McCarthy era, and you dug this up out of the microfiche, right?
I asked for it from Interlibrary Loan,
Yeah.
who clearly had to ask another library to dig it out. Microfiche. Yeah. The copy was really hard to read.
Yes. So we're going to kind of move through these historically, starting with 1961 and ending with a report that just came out a couple of months ago. So this particular one is called "Listen, Yankee" by somebody named C, the initial C, Wright Mills, right? And so, I don't, I mean, I actually told you a little bit, I think this is best sort of summarized by you, who's more familiar with sort of library and librarianship history.
The article's subtitle, as I recall, is something like "Why You Don't See Conservative Books in Your Library."
Yes.
And it's interesting to think about right now, while we have kind of a right-leaning group of people trying to censor books in libraries. And I think it is fair to say that library collections skew left. I think that's a fair assessment. And what the article mentioned was, that the sources that we use to select books also have a left slant. And I remember they specifically mentioned Kirkus reviews, and that was what was so interesting to me was that when we did the panel discussion, one of the other panelists specifically mentioned she was doing research right now about the same thing and mention Kirkus reviews as like they just don't review certain types of books. It's not even that they give them bad reviews, they just won't review them. So, and it's a publication that is used by most libraries for selection. And I think the other important point about this is, like you said, the article was written in 1961. So we're talking about something that's over 60 years old. That's demonstrates that this has been something that librarians have been thinking about for a long time. And as I read the article myself and listened to the other panelists, I remembered a conversation that we had when I was in library school, and I graduated library school in 1991, about book selection. And one thing you'll hear librarians say about their collection is that there should be not only something to offend everyone, right? There should be something to offend everyone in the library, and also that 20% of the collection should be personally offensive to you.
Okay.
And so we talked about this, and also the other thing we do when we select books is, especially in public libraries, has to reflect the community. So if the community is conservative, shouldn't most of our collection reflect that? And where are we getting the information to make those decisions, if not from review sources, and if they're not reviewing the kind of books that the patrons are interested in? We don't know what we don't know. If there's books that aren't reviewed, we don't know that. There are other sources, and we don't always do our due diligence in finding them. I'll say that. So it's been something that we've been aware of for as long as since before I was even born.
Right.
And 30 years ago we were still talking about it, and here we are still talking about it now.
We've even talked about again on another in another podcast about even before the review process, essentially books that don't even get published, books that were written that don't even get published. So we have this sort of cascading kind of effect. And look, we're talking about it and this article is talking about it in terms of right-leaning materials and stuff. At the same time, this could be any, this is relevant to anyone who cares about the library having, a variety of materials, because it could be another group next. It just so happens that it seems as though it's been this, we could use this as an example to say, well, maybe for 60 years it's been this way, and so maybe I'm wrong. But it does feel to me, this makes me feel vulnerable, because it's not just about any single group. It's about the process. And like you said, we don't know what we don't know. This was a short article. Again, a difficult read for a number of reasons, including the print. And then relevant to your point about Kirkus, the type of review materials. The next most recent article was about reviews in the library journal and in something called Choice. So before we go any further, could you just tell us a little bit about each of those?
The library journal is another source for reviews that I know we use it, as in academic libraries. And Choice, I would say, almost any academic library is using Choice reviews. And they come, or they used to. They're mostly online now, but I remember, not so long ago. They came on index card
Yes.
size little slips of paper with a pretty evaluative review. It was, maybe, somewhere between 100 and 250 words on this card. And it always had a final verdict kind of, recommended, not recommended, highly recommended. And I will say that my colleagues and I took those very seriously. If it said not recommended, sometimes, that's all it took. Okay, well,
Yeah. Can't buy everything, and here's a good way to weed
right.
something
I
out.
mean,
Yeah.
because we would get hundreds of those every month. Again, and I've worked with you on, the idea of heuristics, right? The shortcuts we take to make decisions. And that was one easy thing, right? I can't read every single one of those reviews. So first of all, is this something that's in my collection specialty, right? And if not, I left it for somebody else to decide. Um, and I've always said that's a really important part, to make sure you have a breadth in your collection, is that one person shouldn't be doing, not even two, like a lot of people should be doing it, right? Because I do have, any individual person has a bias, and like, this book offends me, I don't want to buy it, but it might be totally appropriate for the collection.
Right.
And somebody else can decide that.
Yeah.
I won't get mad if you do. I'm not going to be the one.
Yeah.
So, sometimes I would read those and think, it wasn't, maybe it was a warm reception, but not, not saying great, everybody needs this. But if it was something that I knew that our collection didn't have a lot on, um, I might look for a second opinion, right? That was always an easy thing to do, was see if somebody else, like Library Journal, also did
Right.
Library Journal
Oh,
review it, and what did they say about it, right?
yeah.
And then I, could make a more informed decision, because sometimes, something, it might not have said, oh, this is great, everybody should have it. And some of them did say that, every library must have this, but I knew that, maybe we just hired a new professor who was doing research in that area, and so we hadn't done collection in it before, and now, we maybe should start. And so, here's something to get us started. So, being aware of a lot of different things is important. Like, it's not just the reviews, but again, if you're in a public library, what is your community looking for? If you're in an academic library, what kind of classes are being taught? Who's doing research in this field? Is anybody doing research in this field? It might be a perfectly good, highly recommended book, but if we don't have a program in it on this campus, I'm not wasting my money on it.
Right. And one thing that, I came to appreciate after I became a professor, was how much, how you all sort of divided up, even though you try to be aware of what's going on overall. You were like the liaison for psychology, for example. And I don't know, were there other departments also? There must be other departments you were the liaison for. So probably foreign languages.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Geography. Yeah.
geography. Yes, that makes sense too. So those are places where Pam has done research, taught, and has personal connections or personal knowledge. So that's another way in which, like, other people could lean into you, right? They could be like, oh,
Right.
well, I'm going to let you make the decision. Like, I don't, I mean, again, these are ways in which people use these heuristics. It's sort of like, oh, well, I don't know anything about geography, so I'm going to let the person whose job it is to pay more attention to that field. If there's a new professor or a new area of research, it's kind of your job to make sure that you know kind of what's going on and stay in touch with those professors specifically. So I didn't know about that, and I can't imagine at a Research One institution, like, how librarians can possibly keep track of all of these things. And it's, pretty
Well, at a
amazing.
Research One institution, like you said, like I was liaison to a variety of different departments, right? What do we have? 40 majors here. And if we're fully staffed, which we never are, there's 9 librarians, right? So, and then there's all kinds of minor programs, and we have to be liaisons to all of those too. So, I was liaison to the Global Languages and Literatures Department because I have a master's degree in Spanish. That makes sense, right? I was liaison to psychology because I'm friends with you. I was liaison to geography because my husband teaches in that department, right? So I learned a lot because I was liaison to those departments, but I didn't have the same kind of understanding of it as I did, for instance, languages.
Right.
But in an R1 institution, there's so many librarians, and the librarian for languages is the librarian for languages. And that's might be all that person, the only liaison responsibility that person has, and it would be a big part of that person's job. So it's a different kind of work.
Yeah, but it is a lot. I mean,
Mhm,
because you have to be a librarian, a professional librarian,
mhm,
and
mhm,
you have to know
mhm.
your liaison field. And
Right.
so you're doing,
Mhm,
you're doing double duty there. It isn't like,
mhm,
I just teach psychology. I don't
mhm,
also have to be a librarian, So so anyway. So in this article, this is by Beth
mhm,
McLeod, called Library Journal and Choice, a review of reviews. And what the author tried to do, again, 1981,
mhm.
so this is the second in our in our historical
So we've gone
um,
from 61 to
to 81.
81, and
Yes,
I've talked about 91 when I was in when I
yes.
was in library school. So, yeah.
So what the author tried to do was compare reviews from Library Journal and from Choice. And she did do a little bit of background. So she was saying library journal. So this was at the time. I didn't look it up. I don't know what the numbers are now. At the time, received approximately 25,000 to 30,000 books a year, from which about 6,000 were chosen for review. And the numbers were very similar for Choice. I have no idea. Do you have any idea what the numbers? I mean, are they similar? Do you think it's grown?
I
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I
I
don't
just
have
I
any.
can say that, like we said just a few minutes ago, we know there's a whole bunch of books that never even get
Right.
published, right? And um but just those numbers you gave, and I'm sure that there's not. I'm sure it's something still like that. Tens of thousands versus thousands, right? That get published versus what gets reviewed. I wouldn't be surprised if those numbers are still right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so right, already we know there's been two cuts, right? The books that didn't get published, then the books that got published that um, the vast majority, right? The vast majority of books that got
Never
published
get
that didn't
reviewed.
get reviewed in the main things that that my colleagues and I are going to look at.
Right.
Um,
That was what shocked me. So I read this, I read this article and I'm like, oh, wow, because basically they found they found almost no difference between, the two reviews in terms of like, oh, were the reviews more positive in one than the other? Were women or men, more positive or assigned more or whatever? They found very little to report, honestly, in the compare, or she did found very little, of, I don't know. I mean, she doesn't do any statistics, but I'm sure that none of those findings, the little minutia, I'm sure none of them were statistically significant. But I read through this and I'm like, oh, big researcher here, right? I don't even recognize the bias at the beginning, until that so she gets to the end and she's like, she just points out, like what you just pointed out. So it's like, yeah. So what did I learn from all of this? She says, well, I learned that the reviews are overwhelmingly positive, basically.
yes.
And so what does that mean? That means that the bias is at the managing editor's desk, because they're the ones who are just, and I'm like, well, duh. So here I am, researcher, trained to detect these biases, and I didn't even notice it. I was just, I was reading for the comparison of the two reviews, and I was really focused on the details of how she, did her little, project and everything. Totally missed that. And I get to the end, and I'm like, oh, duh. She's like, thus the main task of negative selection, so of determining what books librarians should not buy, is done not by reviewers, but rather by the editors in the process of choosing which books should be reviewed. Selection for review amounts in effect to a qualified endorsement by the editors. The fact that 90% of books receiving negative reviews in each journal were not even reviewed by the other journal suggests, even more evidence that this system works. And I'm using little air quotes. The system works. The purpose of a review, then, is less to determine whether any libraries should buy a given book than which libraries should buy it. In this context, it is significant that 50% of the choice reviews and 24% of the library journal reviews contained recommendations for a specific type of library.
Right.
So that was their main thing, was not that no one should buy, like even when you said like, oh, not recommended. Well, not recommended for whom? Because most of them were recommended for some.
Right, most of them are and it'll say for a specific type of library, right? It'll say recommended for public libraries, or maybe large public libraries only, or academic libraries. I mean, it was rare. It was super rare where it just said not recommended, and that meant nobody buy it. Yeah, and I mean, it is like I just said, right? I just said a few minutes ago, if I read something, I might look for a second opinion, but like this article just second opinion is going to be the same as the first, right? Because it got reviewed, right? If Joyce reviewed it, Library Journal reviewed it, and they probably both said the same thing.
And so, and they didn't find any difference. So Choice used a pretty much, I don't want to say a completely anonymous review process, because they did have the names. They did note that the names of all the reviewers for whatever, whether it came out once a week or once a month or whatever, they just weren't attached to a particular review. But the names of reviewers were included. In Library Journal, they were not anonymous reviews. However, the author really didn't find any differences, nothing much to report there. It didn't seem to matter whether it was anonymous or not. But what we have is the editors, who are basically, they also not anonymous, but they, they just appear, sort of like, oh, by the way, here's some editors, and yet they're making most of the decisions, right? And we don't really know who or how they're doing it, because there isn't a process there, that is,
or it's not transparent
open,
anyway.
Right, that's what I mean. It's open and above board. I'm sure there's a process, but there's not a sort of, it's not like your little stack of cards came with a preamble that said, here's how we, like your library has a collections policy. What's their policy for choosing what gets? I'm sure there is one, but
I'm sure there is one, right?
We don't know what it is. Yeah. Okay, so that's 1981. And then we skip ahead to 2002. So let me bring this up. Oops, no, that's the same one I just looked at. Okay, this, speaking of, is this is Ken Kister, Kister, and this is in what is this in? Journal of Information Ethics. So it turns out I had never heard of Ken Kister, but it turns out he was a encyclopedia reviewer. Reviewer, yeah. And so this is a 2002. So we've jumped ahead another 30 years to 2002. No, 20 years to 21 years to 2002. And he's writing a personal account, sort of a little. I wouldn't even call it an op-ed. It's even
a reflection.
Reflection paper. Exactly. And so he had worked for Kirkus Reviews first, and then he went off on his own. So he reviewed encyclopedias for Kirkus, and then went off on his own to do his own thing. So, and he says, Kister's best dictionaries for adults and young people, and Kister's, buying guide for whatever. So he had it, I guess, And so one of the things that he points out was that he says, I was actively interacting with those whose publications I was reviewing. Didn't I run the risk of compromising my role as an honest, objective, and independent reviewer? The answer to both questions is you bet. Now, he defends himself. And look, Pam and I have done some work on heuristics and biases, and we know that you can't, like, he's saying, because I was aware of them, I wasn't doing it. But we all know that we are human beings who rely on, heuristics and biases, because we would be frozen in time and space all the time if we thought deeply about everything. Should I, should I, I don't know, have a peach yogurt or a strawberry yogurt? What are the pros and cons? No, we just grab, it's like, so what, so you can imagine that, we simply couldn't, we're using these all day long, every day, every moment of every day. And so the idea that he can be so hyper aware that he wasn't biased, he does kind of admit that. But again, then he goes back and forth and says, but I was super careful, yeah. So, but he does note in some instances, the companies initiated and paid for my visit. He talked about one particular person with whom he had a fairly close relationship and would visit and, that person's home, and hang out with them. He was that person was a producer of a particular encyclopedia, New Standard Encyclopedia, I think, is the one that that person, so he talks about that. And then he says, he sort of, finishes up with, I believe I kept faith with the reviewer's first obligation to tell the truth. So I don't know. I mean, he says, I feel better for having done this public soul searching. So he kind of like pats himself on the back there.
So I'll say this about that article. I mean, I was really interested in it, and as I read it, so my first job out of library school was actually for a vendor. It was not in a library.
Okay.
I worked for a company called Hispanic Book Distributors. It was in Tucson, Arizona, and we sold Spanish language books to schools and public libraries. And my job, I had two roles there. One was to make catalog cards back when we had catalog cards. But also, I mean, it was like brand new. We were going to make computerized records. It was brand new. But making those catalog records, right? Because when we sold the books, if you wanted, we would also sell at additional price the catalog cards or the catalog records, because, we're selling them to schools that, might have a population of Spanish speaking students, but the librarian doesn't necessarily speak Spanish, right? So it was a service we would provide at an extra fee. So that was one of my jobs, was to create those records. And the other piece of my job was a copywriter. So we had a catalog of books, that we were selling. And my job was to write the copy for, the book descriptions again, and it was, I'm writing book descriptions in English for books that are written in Spanish, again, because the selectors, right, at the libraries might not speak Spanish, right? And so they have to kind of count on somebody else who speaks Spanish to look at the books. And so now this is different because we were selling the books ourselves, right? So we were distributing the books. We would get books from Mexico or other Spanish-speaking countries, and then we had a warehouse, and people could order from the warehouse the books that we had gotten from these other publishers from other countries. and so it was a business and we were trying to sell our product. So every single one, like I was writing these reviews and I would even occasionally put, recommended for school libraries or recommended for public libraries, right? Again, what type of library might be interested in it. But all the books were recommended, right? All the books are
Shocking.
recommended because we were selling them. And I remember one in particular, and this was not the only time it happened, but I remember one book in particular that was just, I didn't know what to say about it because it was so offensive. I can't remember exactly, but it was like something about like written for men, like how to control your women or something
Oh,
like
gee.
that, and like, and I remember like I didn't even like I didn't know what to say about it.
Right.
And I then, there were a few other people who did the copywriting. Most of it was me, but there were a few other people in the company who did it. So I passed it on to somebody else, and like even another man was like, "Be this fucking." And again, like so. um you know Ultimately, right, again it comes down to the boss, right? It was a small company. There was maybe 15 people who worked there. Our big boss, he was the one who made the decision that we were going to carry this book, right? And he decided, and like, but he wasn't going to write the description. He gave it to me, so
Right.
eventually I eventually wrote a really, really short, you know here's what this book is about, and I
Right.
didn't put a
Very
recommendation on it at
just the
all.
facts.
And
Yeah.
and and again, like we did, the big boss, he was the ultimate editor. He didn't change it. He left it just like that. I don't know whether anybody bought it or not, but I remember like it was like this ethical dilemma I had, right? But how, right, where do these, right, the publishers decided which books they were going to publish, and then Dr. Trejo decided which books we were going to carry, and then, and then somebody else is just counting on us to
Right.
provide the
And
books that.
they don't, and is your point, which, is, what the person who's buying the book doesn't speak Spanish,
Right,
oftentimes, not always, but
right,
sometimes doesn't speak Spanish, right? So not only are they relying on all of those steps beforehand, but they're relying on the translation that you did, into an English description. They can't actually verify if they don't speak Spanish. And that reminds me of something, this is I shouldn't say completely unrelated, because obviously it reminded me of it, but a little bit tangential. But in a court, for example, when someone has a translator in court, so they're testifying in their native their first language, and and they have a translator. It is the translation that is official court record, and it is only the translation that can be used in making judicial decisions, not the testimony, only the translation. And so when you think about the nuances of language, I'm sure you could give examples. I can't, because I only speak English, but the slight nuances and alterations, the intonations, the emphasis, and those kinds of things that are lost when you can only use a written transcript that is a translation,
right.
versus having heard it in English. Even if you refer to a transcript, you've heard it in court. You've heard those nuances. You've heard those little things, and I would think it would be similar in translating, in writing a book review. It would be difficult to put into English, and then especially, as you say, succinct English, something that's more nuanced and stuff. And so the only thing that becomes the record, the choice, material, is your translation, and that, by
Right.
its very nature is imperfect, even if, as you tried to be, and this, person, Kister, tries to be as ethical and as accurate as possible. There is still something lost from the reviewer to the person who's making the decision, and even more so when it's a foreign language thing, I would think.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we're going to skip ahead another, so 22 years. We actually have two articles from 2024. So the first one was from January 2024. And this is a commentary. It's although the author, Paul Best, sort of presents this as if he did, like research. And I guess in a way he did, right? So the article's title is How to Combat the Biased School Library Book Selection Process. I don't think that's what it's really about.
If that's not what it's about.
No, he doesn't really get to that, but I mean, it was clickbait for us, right?
Right.
Yeah,
It
because
was. It
that was our
was.
topic. So he is saying that he did research. He found in K through 12 schools. So this is a new study by McCluskey at the Cato Institute. So this author is with the Cato Institute, and the person who did the library search, the collection search, was also from Cato. So it's so what struck both of us when we read this, again, both of us read it maybe the first time through and went, oh yeah, true, but wait, we were just talking about this. So a search of library collections in 200 randomly selected public school districts found that nearly half, 44%, of students had access to progressive books by Ibram X. Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Less than 1% of students had access to books by John McWhorter, Helen Pluckrose, and James Lindsay. Now, if this were college, libraries, we might have been more accepting of that argument. But Ibram X. Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates, those books, or shouldn't say every one of, are more geared, right, towards are easier reads.
Well, I know Ibram X. Kendi. I mean, he specifically wrote a version for middle school students of his book, right? So, yeah, so right, and I'm sure it got great reviews. I'm sure it did, and but John McWhorter didn't write a version for middle school students.
That is definitely not a young adult collection kind of book, right?
Right. So why? Right, and I don't blame the schools for not having it. I wouldn't have bought it. I wouldn't have. I mean, you know this. I have read both Kendi's book and McWhorter's book. I did not read the middle school version of Kendi's book. And they're both available in the library I work in. I can tell you that because I ordered both of them.
Mm-hmm.
But if I worked in a school library, I don't. Maybe I might have done. Maybe there's some, something I could have done some research with and found if there was a comparable book written in the right for the right target audience that countered Kendi's argument. I don't know. I never, I don't work in that kind of library, so I didn't look. But when as you said, the first time I read that article, I was like, oh my God, that's remarkable. I know our library has both, and I ordered both of them. Right? And then I reread it, and I thought, well, right, because Kendi wrote a book for middle schoolers, and McWhorter didn't. And so did the author do the additional work to say, okay, so what middle school writer is there that would have? Do we have one? Maybe there's not one. I don't know.
Right. But they certainly did. They certainly didn't document any effort. So if they did make an effort, it's not in this article.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, look, Cynical Theories is not a young, a young person's book by any means. I mean, it says, there's a stamped series by Kendi, which consists of 3 titles geared towards different age groups. And then Between the World and Me, the Coates article styled the book as a letter to his son.
Right.
So they're age appropriate. So I don't know that we can assume that it is just, as you say, I'm sure they got great reviews, because they were chosen by an
Right.
editor, and then they went out for review, and overwhelmingly reviews are more positive than they are negative. And certainly they would also have, like you say, within that, they would have a recommended for, right? And, the Pluck, Helen's book, McWhorter's book, that kind of stuff they would never have a recommended for, a middle school, high school library. It just wouldn't likely appear there. So yeah, I was I don't want to say I was unmoved by this. What I was moved to think was, gosh, I hope somebody, like you said, I hope somebody's going to follow up on this. I hope there's something beyond this, because I think that it's a good, they make a possible point. They make a point that there could be a point. But I don't think I think the title was misleading, and I was simply, the subtitle is, "What is the cure to seemingly incessant conflicts over the placement of or removal of books from public school libraries? School choice might well be." So it's actually, the bottom line is, I'm pro school choice.
Right. And that's like, was just like the last line. Like, I'm like, the article didn't make a case for school choice at all, as far as I was concerned. It's just like,
so it was a little bit, it is obviously, it was a commentary. I don't think it was, it certainly didn't blow me away. But again, the title was clickbait, and it worked. We did read it, and anyone listening, we recommend somebody actually do that for real. that was not a good attempt.
Right.
Then the last one that we have is from just a couple months ago. It was released in March, the very end of March, actually, of 2024. And this is a report. This was a interview style, survey style kind of qualitative, open-ended survey / interview project by a place called Ithaca SR, which we've already talked about. We don't know what Ithaca SR is. There's no indication, acronym, whatever. We probably should have looked that up before we got started here, but both of us thought the other one, I guess, knew what it was. So it does say Ithaca SR provides research and strategic guidance to help the academic and cultural communities serve the public good and navigate economic, demographic, and technical change. It's a not-for-profit with a mission to improve access to knowledge and education for people around the world. So that's their little, blurb. And so I'm going to actually, hang on a second, I'm going to scroll all the way to the end. So this is they have an interview guide here that's at the end of the article. And so they basically, introduce people, do a little like consent style language. And then they had a list of 7 questions. So, about people's current roles, how they would describe the political dynamics, what's the campus climate around, libraries and librarianship. And then how are staff responding? What kinds of positions is leadership taking? Are these issues impacting your staffing, services, collections? And what kind of support or assistance do you want from national advocates? So these are really broad, what we would call not just double-barreled questions, but there are questions embedded within questions here. So we don't have any information about how well trained these interviewers were or anything like that. So this is a summary of of how people responded, and it's I liked this report a lot. I thought it was really helpful, but I wouldn't say it was particularly scientific in its reporting. It may have been a scientific process, but I didn't get
Okay, so as I recall, there was only maybe 15 people they interviewed. It was a small sampling.
It was, yes. It was 10 people from what they called schools who were sort of in politically contentious states. So maybe places like Florida and Texas, and then 5 librarians or library administrators or whatever, sort of
I think they were all library leaders, so they were deans or directors. They,
yes, you're right.
it wasn't like those of us in the trenches,
You're
right?
right. And 5 in more sort of
Blue
stable,
states.
left-leaning,
Right.
blue states. Yes. So so there's only one. I mean, certainly I'm happy to talk about other aspects of this, but because we're specifically talking about contents, collection policies and biases and stuff, I am skipping forward to like page 20 of the heading that just says content and collections. So the very first line under content and collections, all the library leaders we spoke to made it clear that the content and collections in their libraries were not being censored by state or university policies. However, many emphasize that indirect pressures from policy and politics are affecting their collecting practices. So it's like, okay, the state hasn't, or politics hasn't demanded the removal, right? So that the libraries were not being censored by state or university policy, that the content and collections were not currently being censored by state or university policies, but there was indirect pressure. So I don't quite know what that means.
So, we hear a lot about book banning, right? That I call it a crisis. I use the word crisis when I talk about the book banning that's going on in school and public libraries right now with, I don't even want to say unprecedented. It's so beyond unprecedented numbers of bannings, like nothing. We have never seen anything like this, even in the 80s when, we had the moral majority. We had nothing. We've never had anything like this. But if you look at those numbers, like, how many of these books were challenged in a school library? Most of them. In a public library, a huge percentage. In a university library, maybe 1%. Okay, so we're kind of insulated from that attack. And the challenge, even if there is a challenge, it's unlikely that it will result in a book being removed from the library. Which is not to say it doesn't happen. And we've already established, like, certain books just don't even make it into the library in the first place, right? And but I'll say this, like, one of the librarians at one of the other Massachusetts state universities told me that she'd had a faculty member come to her and requested that a certain author's books be removed from the library. The reason was that this scholar had been canceled in her field, and so therefore we shouldn't have her books in the library now. And the librarian told her no. I mean, she did have a conversation with her, and that's important, right? She didn't just say, no, we don't do that. She had a conversation with her, and this is, I think, the most important thing, right? We need to have conversations. We need to stop shouting each other down. We need to listen. Like, this book is offensive, right? This book offends me. Okay, why does it offend you? Oh, I can see that. I can see why that offends you. Gosh, now I'm reading it. I'm offended by it too. Doesn't mean I'm going to remove it from the library, right? There's other reasons why it's here. Maybe somebody else wants to read it.
Well, again, there's reasons to read books that, if we want to make good arguments, we should be reading the arguments of the other side anyway.
Absolutely.
Right? And so just because I take out a book on, terrorism doesn't mean I'm doing it because I want to become a terrorist. Right. So maybe I am doing a talk on something that's related, or, so this idea that we shouldn't have things because the idea is somehow going to poison our minds. Well, the idea is already out there. I
Right.
mean, the people that are being written about, if it's a LGBTQ or Black or other BIPOC, kind of group, guess what? Those people are out there in the world. So if you ban a book, it does not ban humanity. It
Right.
doesn't
And
ban ideas. It doesn't ban TikTok. It doesn't ban, so, yeah.
I'll give one example that's less less a little more innocuous than terrorism, right? So
Yeah.
um, this is a real story about me. So I was this was 30 years ago. I was working in a public library, um, and we so the McAllen, Texas Public Library is big. It's really big, um, and it's in a border town. In a place where but when the McAllen Public Library was established, there wasn't even a university in the area. There is now, but so it was the research. It was the best place to do research in the Rio Grande Valley. So we had a big collection for a border town of modest size. Um, and I remember I was reading a book, and so kind of a one of those memoir slash scholarly article books. I can't remember what it was, but it's written by a woman, and she, the author mentioned um, having read Pat Boone's book Twixt 12 and 20 when she was, of an age when apparently girls read such a thing. I'd never heard of this book, Twixt 12 and 20 by Pat Boone, but apparently, this author who was, probably a generation older than I was, um, the way she presented it in the book was apparently like, oh, all the girls read this book, right? So I thought, I wonder what Pat Boone had to say. And I thought, now I'm curious. I want to read that book, right? Um, and so my first inclination was, well, I don't know, it was written in the 50s or something. Like I probably have to get it from interlibrary loan. And then I thought, no, wait a minute. I do work in a big library. I bet we have it. And not only did we have it, we had 3 copies. We had 3
Wow.
copies of Pat Boone's book, Twixt 12 and 20, which I'm sure we bought back in the 50s and nobody ever weeded it, right? So anyway, I just pulled it off the shelf and checked it out and read it. It was so sexist. I mean, what does a man have to do?
Right.
It was so incredibly sexist, and I'm thinking, well, I mean, honestly, I don't know why we had 3 copies.
Right.
But maybe again, I would totally believe that we bought 3 copies in the 50s when everybody was reading it and they never got pulled. But I was curious to read it. I'm glad that I was able to just pull it off the shelf and read it. I don't think we should have. I do still question why there were 3 copies. Maybe we only needed 1, for someone like me who was curious. But
Yeah.
like,
Curiosity is a perfectly good reason to read a book.
right?
We shouldn't be just reading something because we agree with it. And
Right.
that seems to be, and I would say even at the university level, this seems to be part of I say argument, it's not really part of the thinking, is that we should restrict or reduce exposure to things that we don't agree with or things that we find offensive in sort of this passing way. Like, did that leave some kind of like long-lasting mark on you, that you read that book or that you were exposed to some of that sexist language? Come on.
No, because I can now talk about it, right? I can talk about it. I can laugh about it. I'm here presenting it on this podcast.
Right.
It's all meta.
Yes. So yeah, I do think that there's sort of this, we've somehow lost touch with this idea that, that that it is part of our personal and professional educations to read and, read things, not just but things that expand our horizons, some things we don't know anything about, things that we're not, that are in opposition to us. And that historically has been part of college education. And I think that we've just kind of drifted away from that. And I don't think it's anything purposeful. I mean, some people think that it is. I think it's, I think it is just drift. and for lots of reasons, cultural drift, that that people are I think it is a good thing that people are becoming aware of it, and that maybe we can sort of remind ourselves of that it's not harmful to be exposed to something that we disagree with. This is transient. Um, so a few interviewees did discuss how content challenges and collection inquiries are being lodged differently than in the past. For example, one interviewee described how they had received an open records request for our entire catalog with metadata. I don't know what they mean by that.
I think they mean like it could mean a lot of things. I mean, metadata might be just how many times was it checked out, or it might include just the cataloging records.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it might be, they want to know how many times it was checked out. I don't know. Maybe they want to know who checked it out,
Right.
which, we hopefully they didn't provide that. I
Yeah,
don't know.
hopefully, but as we know, even from your own personal experience, it can still happen, right? Who checked out what can sometimes get, revealed. And further explained that this type of request had increasingly been made of a school library or a public library where a complete catalog might easily be gathered. Now, they do point out that as a university, that the catalog and this metadata would be so huge that it would, likely
Right.
not.
Yeah. I mean, the catalog, like if you want to know what's in the catalog for, Bridgewater State University, that's public. You can
Right.
go to library.bridgew.edu and you can look at our catalog. You can see you can look at it. Anybody can.
But to
You don't.
provide someone with a bunch of
Right.
data would be just this humongous
Right. And
thing
right, if they want us to download that,
right.
right, you can look at it, but to download it, that's ridiculous.
Yeah,
It's too
yeah.
much information.
But certainly for like K through 12, it's more easily done, especially in the smaller school
Right.
districts and
Right.
that kind of stuff. So it says, a couple of interviewees said, things like people feel more empowered because they feel they have the right to challenge. Everyone believes they are an expert on these things. As a result, a few interviewees said things like the violations of academic freedom in public libraries may pollute the research university and create a chilling effect that stifles discovery, exploration, and ingenuity. So there was concern, even though they were saying like, oh, it hasn't happened, necessarily to this extent to me. We are seeing signs, or we know of, or I went to a conference where somebody spoke about, it happening to them or whatever. So there was this awareness, and these sort of like that the polarization, again, they're saying, oh, well, nobody's come for our books, but there's this fear that may be
Yes.
influencing collection policies quietly.
I believe that is happening. Yeah. And I'll tell you too that uh, very recently, and again, this is just kind of a vague comment we got, but we do have children's books at our library because we are a big teaching university, um, and the books are resources for teachers and for scholars. And so very recently, we got this kind of vague comment about, some of your books are really old and they don't reflect current, thought about, or they're not PC enough or whatever. And yeah, they're not, they're not. Um, and if we were a public library or a school library, those books probably would have been weeded, because they do not reflect current um, thoughts, right? But
Yeah, they don't
what,
reflect the community's
right,
desire, wants, needs,
right.
whatever. Yeah.
But we're a university library, and we have scholars who research the history of children's books, racism and sexism in children's books, right? And so those books, we have them as primary sources for those people, and one of the things that the Library Bill of Rights says is that we trust our patrons to, read the books that are appropriate to them. So, I have to trust that a teacher will come in, and if he or she picks up a book that, like, oh my God, I would, they would look at it, and if it's out of date, would say, yeah, this is not what I'm going to read to my kids. I bet there's another book that's better.
Right.
Right. And we have to trust them to select, to have, what are we training them to do? Right. What are we training them to do? Why do we have education programs if we are not training them to make that determination for themselves?
Yeah. And if we are dependent upon collections, policies, Moms for Liberty, or, I don't know, I'm sure there's similar groups on the left, Moms for Liberty comes to mind, but there's, if we're dependent upon those kinds of groups or the federal government or whatever to make choices, it just makes us dumber. Like, sort of like, stay naive because you're easier to manipulate that way. If it's like, if we go into a library and we are so just dependent upon, the library will only have things that are appropriate. There will never be a book misshelved or a book, in the such and such collection that would offend me or that I wouldn't want to read to my child. It just dumbs us down more. And so I think you're right. There's value in teaching people that the library is there for everyone, and therefore you get to make choices. Like, isn't that a wonderful thing that somebody else hasn't made those choices for you? And again, this could happen. It might be, whatever group you affiliate with. It might be that your group is or isn't currently being targeted, but next week, next month, next year, it could be, the tide may have changed. And so these things matter, and making our own decisions matters. Like, why would we want to leave this up to to government or Moms for Liberty or, any of these groups? Let's make our own choices.
Make our own choices.
Says leaders express two other ways that polarization has altered collections, potentially. One interview explained that whenever the state legislature is upset about something, their collection staff buys the hell out of that subject. In this way, at some universities, political tension and outrage may be fueling the collection of politically divisive or threatened topics. So I can definitely see how that would happen. It's like this knee-jerk reaction, right? Oh, if somebody's trying to ban it, it must be really important, or it must be a good book, or it must be whatever.
Or people are going to start asking about this topic, and I want books on it.
That's true. Right? Yes. So it could be any of those things, right? There's no explanation here. We don't know why people are buying the hell out of those. I
did topics. Like that line.
Yeah. Another leader mentioned discovering that selectors in their library had for some time declined to collect books authored by the state's political leadership. So some kind of avoidance, it's like, oh, well, we don't want, like, would this be just like, oh, we don't want Republican leaders, we don't want Democratic leaders, to be in the library? Or is this just like, oh, we might be viewed as political if we, I don't know. And they don't have an explanation for that either, of course.
I got to say, when I read that, I went on to our catalog and I looked up to see, I just typed in the author Trump. I didn't put Donald Trump. I just put Trump to see what came up. We do have his book, Donald Trump's Art of the Deal.
Okay.
But what was that, written in the 80s or something?
Oh, yeah, a long time ago.
We don't have anything.
It's not even really written by him, of course. It's,
right. Yeah, so I don't know if he's written anything else. I didn't bother. I don't want to read, but we do have the Art of the Deal, but also we have Mary Trump's book, his niece, who wrote the kind of here's how we created him, right? And very a negative portrayal of Donald Trump, and I didn't really see anything else by him or his family.
Yeah. Now, what about? I don't know what state leaders, like here, for example, here in Massachusetts, I don't know who might have
Yeah, I didn't check
written
like to see
books.
if Mitt Romney or
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't check. But there's a lot of books like that are written by politicians that public libraries will have,
Mm.
because people, they hear about them, they want to read them, and we don't necessarily think about getting them, and it's not. It is really just like, oh yeah, that's not a scholarly article.
Right.
That's not a
It's not a
scholarly book,
political science book, or it's
right?
not a history book. It's
Exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. So, and if a politician writes a book like that and somebody asks about it, we sometimes we have it, sometimes we don't. But then I usually just say, you know what, check at the public library. I'm sure they have.
Yeah.
I mean, in the public library in our town, the public library is so close to the university library. You can walk over there from
Right.
here. So that's usually if it. I mean, and that's true of like even just bestsellers that everybody's talking about. We probably don't have them because that's what the public library is for. We
Right.
have different missions.
Right. Some library leaders took great pains to highlight the complex and entangled pressures that their position entails, as they must serve, support, and answer to a host of different constituents with different politics, values, and concerns. So here's like a little quote from an interviewee. You have these constituencies, the legislative leaders at public universities who control the purse strings. You have your alumni, including the alumni that give you money. And then you have your students and your staff. In our case, the legislators are conservative, the alumni are more evenly balanced, the staff and the faculty lean liberal. And so basically you have, libraries and librarians like just in that soup, right? And people sort of picking out it's like, I don't like peas, so I'm going to take all of the peas out of the soup. And I don't, it's like, I'm a vegetarian, I'm picking all the meat out of the soup, and, and focusing totally on those. I'm going to totally focus on the peas. I'm going to totally focus on the meat. And, we kind of lose track of how, you're in this soup of trying to serve so many bosses, if you will. It says, we're playing the game from the heart instead of playing politics, and that's killing us. So that's somebody who's saying libraries should be more political. And I don't know how you felt about that.
Yeah, all of this, there's so much nuance to it. Like, again, I keep thinking about, like, I speak from personal experience. Like, there's some things I don't buy. I didn't buy that book because I thought, like, it offends me. I don't buy
But there's like 8 other people.
Right.
And so you do have that, so it's like, oh,
Right.
well, somebody else. Yeah.
And,
I get it.
And yeah, I mean, I can also say, in Massachusetts, I don't think our legislature has any business. They give us such a minute piece of the university's budget comes from the state. I don't even think they have any business telling us at all. I can't believe we listen to them ever.
Right. Because it used to be when you and I went to school, it was like, 70 to 80% of state college budgets were covered by the state. And now it's anywhere from like 13 to 20% in most states.
Right.
It's very low.
In some cases, it's down in the single digits.
Is it?
Yeah, it's.
So you're right. Like, where do they get off?
Where do they get off? I'm not beholden to them at all, as far as.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm happy to sort of, talk about the rest of this. We could actually do a whole another podcast on the rest of this report, because it's, it's about lots of other things other than what we came together to talk about today. Was there anything else in this article that you definitely wanted to this report, I should say, it's not really an article, that definitely struck you?
No, I think I was able to talk about the things that I remembered that.
Yeah. that are relevant to this discussion. Again,
Right,
there's
right.
plenty of
There's plenty
of them.
more, right?
Yeah,
I
there's
mean, and
plenty more.
it's
Because
yeah.
it's
I
a
mean,
35-page report or whatever, and we've just talked about like 3 or 4 pages
right,
of
and
it.
it just keep in mind that it's the authors, they were aware, right, that it was a small sampling, but nobody had done anything like this before.
Right.
So, it's the start. I mean, they're just saying, here's some stuff, you know, there's plenty more to build on from here, right?
Right.
And I
And not
hope
only,
somebody does.
only not only was it a small sample, but it wasn't even an even sample, like between the sort of the more liberal.
Right.
And here's the other thing, like they don't say this really. They don't say like, oh, liberal blue states and
Right.
red states, but just the idea. I mean, frankly, it would be hard for people to imagine. I think most people in a blue state to imagine what people in a red state are coping with, and vice versa. So, because people did mention, I mean, just like that quote that I just read, that we have that there are, that the left. There's pressure from the left also within, and one of the things that we didn't cover that, again, hopefully we can talk about this article more thoroughly, was that some of the threats from the left are coming from within,
From
and some
within.
from
I
the
think
right,
that's important, right?
and the right comes from outside,
Right. The left is
oftentimes.
internal.
Yeah, and so that's a topic
And I
for,
think, yeah,
so
that's
stay tuned
illustrated,
for another podcast
right?
about this.
That internal is illustrated by the story I told about, one of my colleagues at the other state university,
Yeah.
right, with the canceling, right? Like, oh, this person in my discipline was canceled, so we want you to get rid of these. That was internal left, and it's not going to get the same kind of press that
No.
external threats are getting. And yeah, the other thing I guess um that struck me in that article, and that I was kind of aware of, but is clearly something that, it's not just something, oh, I wonder if this is happening, but it is that recruitment and retention is an issue, in states like Texas and Florida and Oklahoma, right? Like people, if they have an LGBTQ identifying family member, they're not going to move there, right? Like,
Right.
so you have, I mean, you have important universities in those states, right? Big ones,
Yeah.
and
Well, and
serious research
doctors.
going on. And right, if like, no, I'm not going to go there, right? That's not safe for my family, right? And that's an important aspect, I think, that was brought up. And clearly, I know that I've heard stories about, like, at library conferences where they have the recruitment tables and stuff, that people in Florida are just sitting there by themselves, like.
And that
um
will affect, so basically, like the theme of this whole thing, that will affect indirectly, it will affect collections, and so we won't see that, it won't be documented, it will be this sort of underlying, kind of drift. It will be a drift. And maybe some people in those states will be happy with that drift. And other people will feel quite lonely. And, that it won't be obvious. It won't be immediate. But these things matter. So, okay, well, let's leave it there for now.
Okay.
And stay tuned for part 2.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.